Frida Kahlo was born on July 6, 1907, in the vibrant district of Coyoacán, then a village on the outskirts of Mexico City. Her childhood home, the Casa Azul, the Blue House, was filled with color, contradiction, and quiet strength. It would later become a sanctuary, a battleground, and a museum to one of the most iconic artists of the 20th century. Frida was the third of four daughters born to Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer, and Matilda Calderón, a devout Catholic of indigenous and Spanish descent. Her parents were opposites. Guillermo was reserved and intellectual, Matilde religious and emotionally distant. Frida would inherit her father's introspection and artistic eye, but also her mother's fierce resilience. As a child, Frida was imaginative, outspoken, and bold. She read voraciously and asked questions most adults didn't want to answer. But at the age of 6, she contracted polio, which left her right leg thinner and weaker than the other, a physical difference she tried to mask with long skirts, but never allowed to limit her spirit. The illness left her bedridden for months and isolated from other children. During this time, she grew close to her father, who encouraged her to exercise, ride bicycles, and stay mentally sharp. Unlike most girls of her time, Frida didn't aspire to become a wife or a homemaker. Her goal was to become a doctor. She enrolled in the prestigious National Preparatory School in Mexico City at age 15, one of only a handful of girls accepted. There, she stood out not just for her intelligence, but for her rebellious wit, radical thinking, and unique sense of style. She joined a group of young intellectuals known as cachuchas, who debated philosophy, literature, and politics. Frida was drawn to revolution, to ideas that challenged tradition. But even in those early years, before the bus crash that would define her body and before the fame that would define her legacy, Frida Kahlo was already painting herself into the world with sharp edges, unapologetic ideas, and an identity too big to fit inside anyone else's expectations. She wasn't just growing up in Coyoacán. She was preparing to remake herself entirely. On September 17, 1925, Frida Kahlo's life was split in two: the girl she had been and the woman she was forced to become. That afternoon, she boarded a wooden bus with her boyfriend Alejandro Gomez Arias after school. They were laughing, teasing each other, and probably arguing. Frida never did anything halfway. But moments later, the bus collided with a streetcar, and in an instant, her future unraveled into pain, metal, and silence.
The crash was horrific. The streetcar crushed the bus against a wall, splintering wood and flinging passengers. Frida was impaled by an iron handrail. It entered her left hip and exited through her pelvis. Her spinal column fractured in 3 places. Her right leg shattered. Her foot dislocated. Her collarbone and ribs broke. Her shoulder was dislocated. Her abdomen was pierced. She was just 18 years old. A man covered her with a borrowed overcoat. Someone else noticed her body was sparkling, not from blood but from the gold powder she had been carrying in a pouch. It had exploded on impact, dusting her broken form in what looked like glittering ash. Frida was taken to the Red Cross hospital and underwent numerous surgeries over the following months. She spent weeks in a body cast, flat on her back, immobile, writhing with infection and uncertainty. The future she'd imagined in becoming a doctor slipped further away with every passing day. But in that stillness, something began to stir. Her father gave her brushes. Her mother rigged a special easel to hang above her bed. A mirror was placed on the canopy so she could see herself. And there, lying in plaster and agony, Frida began to paint. First out of boredom, then out of obsession. Her first subjects were her own reflection, because she was all she had. But what emerged wasn't vanity, it was survival. The crash had broken her physically, but it had also opened a door into her own mind, her own body, and eventually into the surreal language of pain and identity that would define her art. The girl who wanted to heal others now began healing herself, one brushstroke at a time. As Frida Kahlo lay encased in plaster and steel, a body fighting itself with every breath, she began to paint. What started as a form of therapy soon became a language. and that language was deeply personal, brutally honest, and often hard to look at, which was precisely the point. Frida didn't paint pretty flowers or polite landscapes. She painted pain. Her pain. Physical, emotional, and existential. Her first subjects were self-portraits, not because she was vain, but because, as she famously said, "I paint myself because I'm so often alone, and because I am the subject I know best." Her early works were small in scale, painted on tin or wood panels, inspired by Mexican retablos, devotional paintings meant to tell stories of suffering and miracles. Frida turned this tradition inward. Her body became the canvas, her emotions became the altar. She painted herself as split, as pierced, as bleeding. In one painting, she is impaled by nails like a modern-day martyr. In another, she floats in a barren landscape tethered to a broken column, a metaphor for her shattered spine. She painted herself weeping, fractured, decapitated, and bare, but never passive, always watching.
Her pain was not sanitized. She painted the ugliness of trauma with beauty, defiance, and even humor. Each piece was a reclamation of her body, her experience, and her identity as a woman in a world that often tried to define her. But Frida wasn't just telling her story. She was inventing a new kind of visual narrative, one that blended Mexican folk art, surrealism, medical illustration, and symbolism. Her paintings became dreamlike autopsies of her soul, framed in color, culture, and myth. By the time she recovered enough to walk again, albeit painfully, Frida was no longer the girl who had wanted to be a doctor. She was an artist, and her art was unlike anything anyone had seen. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into a source of creation. Frida Kahlo didn't just paint her pain, she made the world look at it. And in doing so, she turned suffering into a sacred act of self-expression. Still recovering, still painting, and just 21 years old, Frida Kahlo met the man who would become the most profound and turbulent relationship of her life, Diego Rivera. He was 20 years her senior, already Mexico's most famous painter. Massive in stature and presence, Rivera was a giant of Mexican muralism, known for his sweeping, politically charged frescoes that told the story of the Mexican people. Frida had seen his work before. She admired it, but now she wanted his opinion of her work.
She brought her paintings to him at the Ministry of Education, interrupting his scaffolded work to ask bluntly, "Do I have talent?" Diego took one look and said, yes, and not just out of kindness. He recognized in her something rare, an unfiltered voice, raw and unpretentious, full of rage, irony, pain, and beauty. They began a relationship that was as consuming as it was creative. Frida once said, "I suffered 2 accidents in my life, one in which a streetcar knocked me down. The other was Diego." They married in 1929, an odd pairing to outsiders. Diego, massive, unfaithful, politically famous. Frida, sharp-tongued, fiercely independent, already walking with a cane. Her parents called it a marriage between an elephant and a dove. Their bond was passionate but chaotic. Diego supported her art and encouraged her growth as a painter, but he was also endlessly unfaithful, even with Frida's own sister, Cristina. Frida was devastated, and in return, she took lovers of her own, both men and women, including rumored affairs with Leon Trotsky and painter Georgia O'Keeffe. They divorced in 1939, then remarried a year later with different terms. This time, Frida would keep her autonomy, her home, her money, her name. Their second marriage was less about traditional love and more about creative partnership and mutual understanding. Despite the betrayals and the heartbreak, Diego remained a constant force in Frida's life. He challenged her, he wounded her, but he also believed in her, as an artist, as a revolutionary, and as a woman who could redefine what painting could be. Together, they were not peaceful, but they were legendary.
In the 1930s, Frida Kahlo followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York, as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face-to-face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political discomfort. Frida was a proud Mexican nationalist, a committed communist, and an admirer of indigenous traditions. The opulence she witnessed in the United States, especially while the Great Depression ravaged much of the country, only deepened her sense of disillusionment. In letters home, she mocked the culture's materialism and obsession with appearances. She missed the grit, color, and contradiction of Mexico. While Diego painted enormous murals on factory walls, Frida began to paint smaller, quieter revolutions, deeply personal works on tin and canvas. Her style solidified, sharp, surreal, emotional, and intimate. It was during this time that she produced some of her most iconic self-portraits. Frida didn't just paint herself for vanity, she painted herself to survive. Her identity became her landscape. With her body constantly in pain from her accident, multiple surgeries, and a failed pregnancy in Detroit, she turned inward. Her portrait showed her bleeding, fragmented, exposed, yet her face was always calm, always direct, unapologetic. One of her most powerful works, Henry Ford Hospital, shows her lying on a hospital bed, crying, surrounded by floating symbols of loss, a fetus, a snail, medical equipment, a cracked pelvis. It was raw, graphic, and deeply emotional, a canvas that bled with truth. Back in Mexico, Frida followed Diego Rivera on a journey north to San Francisco, Detroit, and New York as he completed high-profile mural commissions. These years abroad brought her face-to-face with American industrialism, wealth, and the contradictions of capitalism, and they left her with deep political discomfort.
She and Diego welcomed Leon Trotsky into their home while he lived in exile. Frida wore Tijuana dresses, traditional indigenous garments, not just as fashion, but as a political and cultural statement. Her art was never disconnected from her beliefs. Her identity, her body, and her ideology all intertwined in her work. While Rivera was painting murals of revolution, Frida painted its human cost, the body in pieces, the mind on fire, and the self always staring back. In exile and in illness, she became not just a painter of pain, but a painter of resistance. When Frida Kahlo returned to Mexico, she was no longer just Diego Rivera's wife. She had become something else entirely, a force, an artist whose work radiated with raw honesty, surreal symbolism, and cultural identity. Back in her homeland, she stepped fully into herself. Her Casa Halzul in Coyoacan became a sanctuary of color and contradiction. Bright cobalt walls, yellow trim, Aztec statues in the garden, monkeys and parrots wandering freely. The house was a living extension of Frida's imagination. It was a blend of tradition and rebellion, elegance and earth. Here, she surrounded herself with pre-Columbian artifacts, ex-votos, folk art, and revolutionary books. She wore bold Tijuana dresses, wove flowers into her hair, and painted amid the scent of copal incense and the sounds of mariachi on the street outside. This period marked an explosion of creativity. Her paintings became more intricate, more symbolic, and more political. Works like the two Fridas revealed a divided self. One in European dress with a bleeding heart, the other in indigenous clothing, strong and composed. It was Frida's visual autobiography, a portrait of love, loss, and heritage. She exhibited her work in Paris, where artists like Picasso, Breton, and Kandinsky praised her fiercely original style. But even among the surrealists, Frida stood apart. When André Breton tried to label her as one of their own, she pushed back. They thought I was a surrealist, but I wasn't. I never painted dreams. I painted my own reality.
She painted Mexico, not the romantic postcard version, but the living, breathing country she adored. Her work pulsed with symbolism: skeletons, hummingbirds, hearts, thorns, corn, and blood. She honored the indigenous roots of her homeland while unmasking the violence of its past and present. But even as her artistic voice grew stronger, her health continued to decline. Multiple surgeries, infections, and chronic pain became daily realities. Still, she painted through it, propped up in bed, torso bound in corsets, fingers clenched around the brush. Frida had returned to Mexico not to rest, but to reclaim her power through paint, through politics, and through her fearless embrace of the self. Frida Kahlo's body continued to betray her. Her spine was deteriorating. Her right leg was constantly infected. She underwent more than 30 surgeries in her lifetime, often in grueling succession. At times, she was bedridden for months, encased in body casts or immobilized by traction devices that stretched her bones apart. But still, she painted. Each canvas during these years became both a release and an act of resistance. Her works grew darker, more defiant.
She painted with a clarity sharpened by pain, refusing to hide behind metaphor. In The Broken Column, she presents herself split down the middle, her body pierced with nails, a cracked ionic column replacing her spine. Yet her face is stoic, her gaze unflinching. Pain for Frida was no longer just a subject. It was her companion, her antagonist, her muse. Her political voice also grew louder. She joined the Mexican Communist Party, marched in demonstrations, wrote fiery letters, and called out imperialism and injustice. When her health no longer allowed her to walk, she appeared in protests in a wheelchair, defiantly holding signs and shouting slogans. Frida was eventually given her first solo exhibition in Mexico, a long overdue celebration of her art. But her health was so fragile, doctors told her she couldn't attend. So she did what only Frida would do. She arrived by ambulance, carried in on a stretcher, and placed in the center of the gallery on her hospital bed. Dressed in traditional finery, surrounded by her own work, she greeted guests with tequila, laughter, and that fire still burning in her eyes. Her final paintings were both childlike and harrowing. In Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick, she painted herself wearing a steel corset, cradled by the hands of Marx, casting away symbols of oppression. Her last known work was a still life of sliced watermelons, one piece bearing the words, "Viva la vida," long live life. Even in the face of death, she remained defiant, joyful, and political. Frida Kahlo's last portraits weren't just self-portraits, they were acts of revolution, painted in pain, but always signed with life. Frida Kahlo died in the same place she had been born, La Casa Azul in Coyoacán. The official cause was listed as a pulmonary embolism, but those closest to her whispered of something deeper. She had been ill, yes, but also exhausted by pain, by surgeries, by the long war with her own body. Just days before, she had attended a political protest against the CIA coup in Guatemala. Weak and wheelchair-bound, she insisted on going, her clenched fist raised in the air. Revolution remained her final heartbeat. Her last diary entry was brief but piercing. "I hope the exit is joyful, and I hope never to return." Frida's funeral was held at the Palacio de Bellas Artes, Mexico's most prestigious cultural institution. Her body, draped in the red flag of the Mexican Communist Party, was watched over by friends, family, artists, and revolutionaries. Diego Rivera was inconsolable. He called her the greatest love of his life, even as his betrayals had nearly broken her. But in the years that followed her death, something extraordinary happened. Frida Kahlo refused to disappear. At first, her name was whispered only in art circles. Her works weren't easy to categorize, too political for surrealists, too surreal for traditionalists. But slowly, her image, her story, and her defiance began to resonate.
Through the feminist movements, as scholars and activists reclaimed forgotten voices, Frida's became louder. She wasn't just a painter anymore. She was a symbol of pain turned into beauty, of feminism born through resistance, of Mexican identity celebrated without apology, of queerness, disability, revolution, and authenticity.
Her face, unibrow, gaze, and flowers in her hair became iconic. Her home became a museum. Her diary became a sacred text. And her paintings now hang in the world's greatest museums. Frida Kahlo had lived much of her life in Diego's shadow, but in death, she stepped forward. She didn't just leave behind paintings, she left behind a mirror and dared us all to look, not with pity, not with fear, but with fire. Today, Frida Kahlo's face is everywhere, printed on t-shirts, painted on murals, turned into dolls, memes, posters, and icons. Her signature unibrow, her flower-crowned hair, her direct gaze, all instantly recognizable. But what makes her legacy powerful isn't just that people know her face. It's that they recognize the truth behind it. Frida didn't try to be flawless. She didn't fit into boxes. She wasn't conventional, and she didn't care to be. In a world that demands perfection, she gave us realness. Raw, messy, vibrant, angry, joyful, contradictory realness. She celebrated what made her different. Her disability, her queerness, her politics, her culture, and turned it into art that transcended borders and decades. She's become more than an artist. She's a global symbol of defiance, feminism, cultural pride, and creative resistance. For queer communities, she's a fearless bisexual icon who lived openly and unapologetically in a time that demanded silence. For women, she's a reminder that power doesn't require permission. For disabled artists, she's proof that pain can fuel the brush, not stop it. And for Mexico, she's a daughter reclaimed, fierce, folkloric, and forever part of the national soul. Her paintings, once dismissed as too strange or too personal, are now among the most revered in the world. Works like The Two Fridas, Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace and Hummingbird, and The Broken Column aren't just seen. They're felt deeply by anyone who has ever suffered and needed to turn that suffering into something sacred. She lived in the margins and turned them into center stage. She embraced contradiction, a communist who wore gold, a woman betrayed who loved again, a body in pieces with a soul unbreakable. And through it all, she painted not just with color, but with conviction. Frida Kahlo never asked to be a symbol. She simply told the truth about herself. And in doing so, told the truth for millions of others who had never seen themselves reflected in art before. Now when we see her face, we see courage. We see color. We see resistance. We see Frida. Not gone, but immortal.